And welcome back, listeners. Thank you so much for joining us for another episode of the Invisible Threat Podcast. As is normal and as is becoming commonplace, I am joined by my esteemed co-host, Dr. Matt Eby, coming in from Kansas City, and his better half, Joanne Eby, co-author of the Invisible Threat Podcast. So let me go ahead and welcome both of them in and say thank you again, Joanne, for coming in on a regular basis here recently. We're very honored to be able to have you join us for the Invisible Threat Podcast.
You're welcome.
Before we get really started in the podcast, you and Joanne both got a chance in our last episode talking about how we were going to be in Kansas City, how we were going to New York City. A little bit different, New York City and Kansas City, right? But the two of you gave some phenomenal options for me and my better half, Christina, to go to a few different places while we were in New York City. And just as we're time stamping this again, and I have to tell you, for our first time ever going to New York City, I was sort of fearful of the unknown. I'd never been in New York City, but Joanne, you gave some really great recommendations of like what to do. And I got to tell you, phenomenal recommendations. So thank you so much for that.
Oh, you're more than welcome.
So we got a chance to get a nice Guinness at and by the way, it's St. Patrick's Day today, time stamping it again. So it was going to New York City. It's like they're celebrating St. Patrick's Day all the time at the pubs around there. But I don't know what it was about the Guinness, but you're right. It was like the best Guinness I've ever had in a pub, and then I can remember.
Especially a pub in North America. It's phenomenal. And I have fond memories of my time living in Manhattan and going to those pubs on 2nd Avenue. Yeah, just some amazing, and the food as well. And the joie de vivre when you're in those pubs, they just really make you feel welcome. And it's like that Irish welcome feeling. So I always enjoyed those.
We ended up going to an Irish pub for lunch the first day. And by the way, the weather was spectacular day one, where it was like upper 60s, lower 70s. Me and Christina got like 15,000 steps in, kind of like going to Disney World for a day, right? 15,000 steps in, just walking all over the place, right? We went to the New York City Library. And what I found to be interesting, and you probably know this already, is just how condensed everything is there, and you don't realize it. So you know all these milestones, right, or these landmarks. So we just like, oh, look, there's the New York City Library, right? Oh, look, there's Grand Central Station. Oh, look, there's, you know what I'm saying? It's just like I say you stumble upon them, but it's just like they're all so condensed. It was just such an amazing experience. But your big thing that you said, and I have to, listeners, listen up. If you've never been to New York City before, and I've been all over the world, which is ironic that I've never been in New York City until last week, but your recommendation and suggestion to go to the Empire State Building at night was spectacular. It was an unbelievable experience. The view was simply stunning. As you know, I sent some pictures to you guys. But what I found to be the most interesting part about that is that on the north side of the building, or the south, I can't remember which one it was like hurricane gust winds. On the opposite side, no wind at all. I'm like, how is that even physically possible? In any event, it was a great recommendation, and thank you for all of those suggestions you made, Joanna, and Matt too.
New York is just fantastic. It's greatest cities in the world, and it's when Joanna and I were there together. She lived there for a while before I even knew her, but when we were there together, we did a lot of work on the East Coast. It was just the greatest city ever. So it's just wonderful place to be. Great people, great food, great atmosphere, and like you're saying, all the places that you've seen in movies throughout your entire life, they're just one after another. So it's I'm glad you had such a great time. You guys look so happy.
We ended up going to a pub for lunch, and then we ended up finding another pub close to the hotel we were staying at, and it had because it had live music, right? So we get there, and the theme was, me and Christina started going like, is this prerequisite? So Irish pub, number one, Owen, the bartender from Ireland, right? He had that, the Gaelic, it was really, it was cool. I mean, easily understandable. Then at night, Sarah, our bartender, totally different Irish pub, also from Ireland. I'm like, is this prerequisite to like be a bartender at an Irish pub? You have to be from Ireland.
It certainly is. That seems appropriate.
It does seem appropriate, no doubt about it. So, anyway, let me ask you something, Matt. Back in episode 2, and I know that we like reflecting on these podcasts, when I wanted to have more of a voice in the podcast, and, at that moment that we had between us, it felt a little uncomfortable.
Yeah, well, and as we've gone through these podcasts together, Carter, and listeners can tell, you and I really get along well together, and as well as Joanne and Christina, we really get along very, very well. So it did feel a little bit uncomfortable, as you're saying.
I would argue famously we get along, but, it felt like a disagreement, and we tend to get along and we agree, all the time, but it felt like that a bit of a disagreement, right?
Yeah, and going back, if you remember at the end of episode 1, going all the way back to episode 1, you had mentioned that you may want to talk a little bit more about yourself, and I would say that that was the beginning of it. And in episode 2, it was a disagreement.
Yeah. So, but we've spent the last few episodes now saying something very specific, that a disagreement really at the end of the day is just data.
And that's right. That's exactly what our hypothesis is.
Yeah. So then what was the data in episode 2? Like, what was actually driving it? Because if disagreement is data, then the real question is, what's the source of that data?
The disagreement created tension between us, and that tension created energy in the room. And a compass will only work when there is magnetic tension.
Yeah, so then in episode 6, we talked about the AFIRE Compass and identified where each of us were during that episode.
That's right. And I was positioned on the north, represented by my hesitation to change our original agreement so soon. That was pulling one way on the diagram on the compass.
Yep.
And you were south,
Yeah.
represented by your desire to have more of a voice. That was pulling the other way. Without that tension, the needle on the compass doesn't move. Fiduciary judgment works the same way. When fiduciaries exercise discretion, different forces start pulling on judgment. As we said, anchors, fairness, identity, and risk. That creates the AFIRE compass. And when those forces create tension and start pulling against each other, that's when the AFIRE compass actually starts to work. The compass tells you where judgment is pointing, and assumptions tell you why the judgment ended up there.
So the tension between us in episode 2
Was the compass starting to work?
Yeah. Yeah. So episode 2 wasn't actually, as some of the listeners may have been thinking, it wasn't a breakdown at all.
Not at all.
So it was the compass that actually started to work.
Because of the tension.
Yeah.
Most fiduciary systems try to eliminate that tension as fast as possible.
Yeah, because it feels uncomfortable, right? Now, most people don't like to feel uncomfortable. People in the room, they want to get past that moment so quickly and so fast because of that, uncomfortable feeling.
But if the tension disappears too quickly, as we've stated, the compass never engages. And when the compass doesn't engage, the assumptions underneath the judgment stay invisible, what we've called the invisible threat. When the tension disappears quickly, it doesn't mean the problem is solved, but the assumptions that produce the tension in the first place simply get carried forward into a future time frame.
So then entering the gate, right, is the moment the room decides to stay inside that tension long enough to see what's actually pulling on judgment.
That's exactly right. where the compass is pointing, and whether fiduciary judgment is drifting. Keep in mind that fiduciary drift doesn't start with bad judgment. It starts with an assumption that remained invisible and was never questioned. But as you state, once you enter the gate, it means you are managing emotion long enough to stay within the tension, allowing the orientation on the compass to appear and making the assumptions visible. Structure, fairness, risk, and identity. These dimensions were always there, but until the compass started working, we simply couldn't see them.
Hence the invisible thread, right? So wait a second. That's what Joanne said actually in episode 7, right? So if the gate stays open long enough, the assumptions, right, behind the judgment start surfacing.
That's exactly right.
Joanne, what assumptions were you talking about?
Let me give you an example of what this sounds like in practice. When anchors start pulling on judgment, the assumption usually sounds something like this. If the judgment follows the rules and precedent, then that judgment must be correct.
Right, like someone saying, well, that's what the document says.
Exactly. And that's the anchor.
Joanne, what about fairness?
Well, fairness sounds a little different. The assumption usually goes like this. If the judgment treats similar situations the same way, then it must be fair.
Well, that's a big one in trust committees, right? Quote unquote, we treated the other beneficiaries the same way.
Yes, you hear that a lot. The tendency towards consistency starts to pull on the judgment.
And when risk starts pulling, what about that?
Well, that's when the room starts thinking about defensibility. The assumption sounds like this. If the judgment is defensible, it must be correct.
And that one shows up in exams all of the time.
Exactly. You will hear people in the organization say, as long as we can defend this approach to the examiners, we'll be fine.
And how about identity?
That's when identity starts shaping the interpretation. The assumption will sound like this. If the judgment fits my role, whatever my role in the organization happens to be, then it must be right.
So, meaning the trustee sees it one way, but the examiner sees it a completely different way.
Exactly. The role you occupy will change how the judgment looks to you. You will hear something like, well, as trustee, we have to see this differently. And when people disagree in a fiduciary space, they are usually not disagreeing on the decision itself. It's just that they are operating from different assumptions about what right even means.
Can we go on one level deeper here? Because it sounds to me like these assumptions don't just guide judgment. It seems like they can also distort it.
That's true, they can. Every one of these 4 dimensions has a range. And what we see in practice is not whether the dimensions are present. They're always present. It's how much weight each one is carrying at any point in time.
So, too little and the system loses control, but too much and the system will start to break in a different way.
Exactly. Let's start with anchors as an example. If there's too little structure, too little sort of rules and regulations, infrastructure, and then decisions will lose their consistency because that structure is not in place.
Well, and we know the problem there. That's when everyone starts doing it their own way.
That's right. But too much on the anchor side.
And that's that rigidity that we talked about, right?
Exactly. You follow the rules even when the outcome doesn't make sense anymore. Fairness works a similar way. Too little fairness starts to feel arbitrary. It may even look like favoritism.
Yeah, people start asking, why them, but not me?
Exactly.
So, really, what you're saying is that everything has to be equal.
Well, if there's too much fairness, that's the drive. Even when circumstances between situations aren't exactly the same, there's that tendency to ensure that everything is equal, everything is the same.
Right. Right.
And that's the pattern that the examiner had seen with those files. Identity, if there's too little identity when judgments are being made.
Yeah, then no one owns the judgment, right? So, and then of course, no one's going to take responsibility.
Exactly. Judgment will become mechanical. But if there's too much identity at play,
Yeah. Now it becomes personal, and people will become overbearing, pushy, and bossy.
exactly, their ego will start driving the outcome instead of informing the judgment. Now, as to risk, remember, in the fiduciary space, this is sensitivity to risk, not how much risk is taken. It's in the very nature of fiduciary work that you do have to accept certain levels of risk. So, the sensitivity to risk, if there's too little sensitivity, you will expose the organization.
Yeah, you're taking things on that you don't fully understand.
That's right. And exposure to too much fiduciary risk can start to skyrocket, or the wrong types of fiduciary risk. However, if you're too much on the risk side, meaning that you're very risk averse,
Yeah, then nothing moves and everything gets denied.
exactly, because everything will get filtered through the defensibility lens, and people will become wary of defending anything. They don't feel safe making the decisions any longer. Fiduciary judgment does not break because these forces are present. Fiduciary judgment breaks when one of those forces starts carrying too much or too little weight.
And then there's the fifth one, emotion.
When emotion starts pushing on the system, the assumption sounds like this: if the tension feels uncomfortable, something must be wrong.
So the tension in the room, in any one of those rooms, isn't the problem.
Just like we said before, that's exactly correct. It's the signal.
And remember, if that tension gets resolved too quickly, the room moves past it too quickly, you never actually enter the gate. The AFIRE Compass never has a chance to show you what was really pulling on the judgment. And that's the moment fiduciary drift will settle in.
The most dangerous assumption in fiduciary judgment is the one that everyone in the room agrees with.
So let's bring this back for the listeners. So nothing's broken, nothing has failed, but something underneath the judgment was never examined.
And that's the part most fiduciary systems never get to, what we're calling the invisible threat. They fix the process, they add policies, they reinforce structure, but they never surface the assumptions. These are all called technical fixes.
And if you can't see the assumptions, you can't understand the underlying cause of the judgment.
And if you can't understand the judgment, you simply just keep on drifting.
Most organizations simply live with their underlying assumptions. They don't see them, they don't question them, and over time, they start to depend on them. We don't. Listeners, thank you so much for joining us for another episode of the Invisible Threat Podcast. It is simply amazing every single time whenever we have these podcasts on how much reflecting back on previous podcasts has really been helpful for us. So make sure you like, share, and subscribe, or what my esteemed co-host, Dr. Matt, likes to say, love your podcasts. And wherever you get them, make sure that you do subscribe to the Invisible Threat podcast. As is normal on this show, we want to thank our co-host, Dr. Matt Eby, for joining us, and our regular resident co-host here recently, Joanne Eby. Thank you guys both so much for walking all the listeners through that so they can get a better gauge and understanding of what the invisible threat really is and how the AFIRE Compass really helps to guide.
Carter, thanks so much for hosting for us. It's always a great honor to work with you. You're so good at doing this, and we hope the listeners get tremendous value out of this and doing a great job for their beneficiaries and for the people that they serve. It is really a true honor to share this information with them.
Yeah, well, you are the trust doctor, so there you go. You being on here with me has been fantastic, and allowing me to be able to guide along a little bit of the way and host here has been it's been my treat. So
Yeah.
For my co-host, Dr. Matt Eby, and our guest again, Joanne Eby, I'm Carter Wilcoxon, Epic Services Company, thanking you for joining us for another episode. We will see you next time on the Invisible Threat Podcast.